Hello and welcome to our Art and Architecture webinar series. I'm Kurt DiCamillo, the Curator of Fine Art at American Ancestors. I will be your moderator and virtual MC for today's event. American Ancestors is a nonprofit organization supported by our members and donors. We are the oldest and largest genealogical society in the world. We specialize in providing resources, research, and expertise that uncover the stories of families, family objects, and family homes. We are pleased to offer such programming for our members and friends around the world. If you have any questions, please feel free to type them into the question panel at the bottom of your screen at any point during the presentation. We will answer as many as we can at the end. I also want to note that we are broadcasting from our homes to yours with various limitations and distractions. We apologize in advance if there are any interruptions from our end, and thank you for your patience if something like that does occur. Even if we do lose connection, you will have access to a full recording on our website that you can watch at any time. Today, we will be treated to a fresh perspective of Queen Victoria, a monarch for whom the personal and the political were closely intertwined, something that severely affected her relations with her 10 prime ministers. An astonishingly large proportion of her PM's time had to be devoted to handling their demanding and opinionated sovereign, who had pronounced views on state affairs that she expected to be heeded. Her relationships with some of her premiers were notable for their warmth. She had a girlish adoration for her first prime minister, the urbane and charming Lord Melbourne, while the Tory leader, Benjamin Disraeli, enchanted her with flattery, filling her life with poetry, romance, and chivalry. With others, things went less well. She conceived the strongest antipathy for the great Liberal William Gladstone, who she dubbed, quote, a half-mad firebrand. Driven apart by political differences and temperamental incompatibility, by the time Gladstone became prime minister for the fourth time, they mutually detested each other. Sometimes comic and sometimes shocking, the bitter clashes and affectionate interactions Victoria had with her prime ministers sheds a fascinating new perspective on her reign. I would like to thank Amy Griffin for her very generous support of the Art and Architecture webinar series. We could not do what we're doing today without the support of people like Amy. So thank you, Amy. Anne Somerset, daughter of the 11th Duke of Beaufort, has written 7 books, including an acclaimed biography of Elizabeth I and The Affair of the Poisons, Murder, Infanticide, and Satanism at the Court of Louis XIV. Her last book, Queen Anne, The Politics of Passion, was awarded the Elizabeth Longford Prize for Historical Biography. Anne's most recent book is Queen Victoria and Her Prime Ministers, which is what she's going to talk about today. Please join me in welcoming Anne Somerset.
Well, thank you very much for those kind words of introduction. I'm absolutely delighted to be given the opportunity to talk today about my book, Queen Victoria and Her Prime Ministers. Although this is the first time I've ever given an online lecture, so I hope that I managed to master the technique and successfully convey my enthusiasm for my subject. Although I'm also rather hoping that I will inspire a desire in listeners to find more about it, out more about it themselves. Before I'd done much research on this project, I had completely subscribed to the belief that Queen Victoria was truly a model constitutional monarch who was careful never to exceed the limited powers allotted to her. I knew that Walter Bagehot, the Victorian authority on the Constitution, had stated that the British sovereign had only 3 inalienable rights, namely the right to be consulted by her ministers, the right to encourage, and the right to warn. And I thought Victoria never disputed this interpretation. I accepted the view expressed by one of her Prime Minister's private secretaries, that the Queen reigns, her ministers govern, and that, as another prominent politician believed, the British monarchy was little more than ornamental and consultative. Victoria certainly prided herself on abiding by the constraints imposed on her, believing that, as her Times obituary would state, she was steeped in the spirit of the Constitution. And indeed, to an extent that she said meant that she was sometimes unable to do what is right. She once declared, "The life of a constitutional monarch is a hard and trying one." And it took me some time to realise that really she did not always stick to the rules quite as meticulously as this would imply. The truth is that although Victoria claimed that she did not consider state affairs a woman's province, and that she hated being plagued with politics, she actually was extraordinarily politically active throughout her reign and relished the role she played. Although it wouldn't be right to exaggerate her power, towards the end of her reign, a Tory minister talked of the much greater influence she has on the course of political affairs than is generally supposed. So this coronation portrait of 1838, depicting the newly crowned 18-year-old Victoria gazing meaningfully at her sceptre, is not inappropriate because for Victoria, the trappings of monarchy were more than merely symbolic, and she truly did wield the sceptre to noticeable effect throughout her reign. Victoria was a very opinionated woman, and inevitably her close involvement in politics meant that she did not always see eye to eye with her 10 prime ministers. It wasn't always easy to deal with a sovereign who once declared that when she had a strong conviction, she generally found that she was right. So here her prime ministers are pictured clustered together. And several of these men served more than one term as prime minister, and so had extensive dealings with the Queen. And they had to devote a surprisingly large proportion of their time to handling her, for she could not simply be ignored. A member of Tory Prime Ministers Benjamin Disraeli's cabinet noted that to manage, flatter, and keep in good humour the Queen was in itself a full-time occupation. But if it required a great deal of effort on Disraeli's part, in his case it did at least yield results, as the Queen grew to love him. Other prime ministers were notably less successful. In particular, William Gladstone found dealing with the Queen to be perhaps the worst aspect of being Prime Minister. He once groaned to a colleague, "The Queen alone is enough to kill any man." In theory, the sovereign was obliged to support any government that commanded a majority in the House of Commons, and not to allow personal predilections and prejudices to complicate their relationship. But Victoria didn't always manage to live up to this ideal. Rather than staying above party, by the end, she scarcely troubled to disguise her disapproval of the Liberal Party and her leaning towards the Conservatives, So much so, indeed, that in 1883, the Liberal Prime Minister William Gladstone actually declared that there was no greater Tory in the land. Victoria was a woman subject to powerful emotions, and she had pronounced views about individual politicians with whom she interacted. She once declared, quite accurately, "I am no hypocrite. I can't conceal what I think." And although on the whole what Gladstone called her high good manners ensured that civility was preserved, even when she felt antipathy for a prime minister, this was not invariably the case. In old age, she cheerfully admitted to a lady in waiting that as to likes and dislikes of premiers, she had them very strongly. When Victoria came to the throne in 1837, aged 18, she very quickly grew to adore the incumbent Prime Minister, Lord Melbourne, who, as this portrait by John Partridge shows, at 58, Melbourne remained a fine-looking man. But for the Queen, his principal appeal lay in his legendary charm. He had a wonderful sense of humour and was famed for being a brilliant conversationalist, and Victoria found him absolutely delightful. In many ways, he was an excellent mentor. He filled in the gaps in her knowledge without making Victoria feel ignorant, educating her about recent history and political developments, while reconciling her to the challenges and responsibilities of her position. Above all, however, he made politics and state business seem fun. It was a mutually rewarding relationship because Victoria's father had died when she was under a year old, and the Prime Minister therefore assumed a quasi-paternal role. He, in turn, treated her like the daughter he had never had. Melbourne was a man with a great capacity for loving without having anything in the world to love, so somebody said at the time, so the Queen filled a void in his life. One rather cynical observer actually believed that Victoria's feelings for Melbourne were actually sexual, though she does not know it. But in fact, although she was in love with him, in a manner of speaking, this was in a girlish and essentially innocent way. She did find his physical appearance attractive, writing soulfully of his beautiful, noble features and the sweet expression. And as a talented draftswoman, she several times sketched him and produced very creditable likenesses. And here is one of them. Every day, they would spend several hours together. They would be closeted together for 2 hours in the morning to discuss politics. And in the afternoons, Melbourne regularly accompanied her when she went out riding, as you can see from this painting by Francis Grant, done in 1839 or 40, when Melbourne, wearing a grey top hat, is shown on the Queen's left as she rides in Windsor Great Park. In the evenings, Melbourne dined with her, and even when there were many other guests, he was always placed next to her. Whenever he left the room, her eyes followed him, and she was tense till he returned. Later, Victoria would come to feel that her uncritical love for Melbourne had been at last quite foolish, but it's quite understandable that she found him so enchanting. The more I see and get to know him, the more I get quite to love him, she enthused. Another time she gushed. It is such a delight to talk with him. He is so full of knowledge and agreeable. In her journal, she faithfully recorded his observations and comments on the grounds that his remarks are always so clever and funny. The result is that we have a wonderful record of their relationship, and by documenting their daily encounters in such detail, Victoria ensured that we can grasp something of the magic of Melbourne's character. But the problem was that Melbourne's Whig government, the Whigs were the precursors of the Liberal Party, but his Whig government did not have a large majority in Parliament. And so it was obvious that they could not stay in power forever. And when that happened, it would be the Queen's duty to support an incoming Tory government. Unfortunately, the Queen could not reconcile herself to this concept, not least because she had taken against Tory leader Sir Robert Peel, whom she found a cold, unfeeling, disagreeable man. Melbourne remonstrated, "You shouldn't give way too much to personal dislikes," but Victoria ignored this. In 1839, it began to look likely that the government would have to resign, and this plunged Victoria into agony, grief, and despair. She nevertheless managed to block a change of government at that point by flatly refusing to replace any of her current ladies-in-waiting, several of whom were the wives of Melbourne's cabinet ministers, with Tory nominees. And as a result, Peel declined to take office. And this cartoon, which I hope you will be able to see soon, by John Doyle, shows the episode in a humorous light, with Victoria and her ladies reviving a slumbering Lord Melbourne with smelling salts. But others, took a graver view of the situation. One observer commented, "It was a high trial of our institutions when the caprice of a girl of 19 can overturn a ministry." Well, she got away with it just that time. But it was obvious to everyone except Victoria that the situation couldn't go on forever. Melbourne did his best to make her understand this, but with little success. In fact, if anything, over the next 2 years, her antipathy to what she called the vile, confounded, infernal Tories grew yet more pronounced. When Melbourne tried to persuade her to invite leading Conservatives to her 1840 wedding to Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, she would not hear of it. She raged of the Tories. What does she owe them? Nothing but hate. It was not until 1841 that she finally had to accept a Conservative government led by Peel after the Whigs were decisively beaten in a general election, notwithstanding Victoria's attempt to help them by donating £15,000 to their campaign. So I think there is now a picture of Peel, which I hope you can see. Oh, yes, that's Peel standing with the Duke of Wellington, and then there's also a portrait of Peel on his own. And for a time, Victoria's relations with her new government were very awkward, but gradually, largely because Prince Albert was a great admirer of Peel, she overcame her aversion to him. And in fact, after a bit, she became almost as devoted to him as she had once been to Melbourne. She remarked, "I used formerly to fancy that Peel was so stiff and cold, but oh no, not when I got to know him well." When Peel fell from power in 1846, after splitting the Conservative Party by driving through a repeal of the tariffs on imported grain known as the Corn Laws, she was scarcely less heartbroken than she had been by Melbourne's departure. So this change of attitude owed a lot to Prince Albert's influence. And here he is. He's a very handsome young man. But although Victoria was very, very in love with him, she had initially been very reluctant to let him wield any political power. But gradually, he established a major role for himself, and the Queen very much deferred to his views. With each successive pregnancy, she was ready to delegate more and more to him, for, as she noted in 1846, really, when one is so happy and blessed in one's home life as I am, politics, provided my country is safe, must take only a second place. Here now is the next slide, which is a painting depicting that happy domestic life, with Victoria gazing adoringly and submissively at Albert, who in this painting has just returned from a hunting outing, but who in fact devoted more and more time to working on the Queen's behalf. Obviously, Victoria couldn't detach herself from state affairs as much as she might have wished, but she relied very much on her husband for guidance. Albert trained her how to analyse political problems and on foreign policy matters, and he also schooled her about her other responsibilities as a monarch, promoting the idea that the royal family must set a good example and be morally unimpeachable. Above all, in constitutional matters, he drilled into her what he called the great axiom, namely that the Crown supports the ministry of the time so long as it commands a majority and governs with integrity. And in accordance with this doctrine, they behaved correctly to Peel's successor as Prime Minister, who I hope you can see a picture of here, who was called Lord John Russell, even though he wasn't a very appealing personality. But they had terrible difficulty stomaching the activities of Russell's Foreign Secretary, Lord Palmerston, also pictured here. And in time, they developed a truly obsessive hatred for him. The problem was that Palmerston expected a completely free hand in the conduct of foreign policy, whereas Victoria and Albert believed that he should act under their direction. On numerous occasions, Palmerston simply ignored their wishes, until an exasperated Victoria complained that his treatment of her was almost a mockery. Having come to believe that Palmerston was a bad man with not a grain of moral feeling, she demanded that Prime Minister Russell dismiss the Foreign Secretary, who, she said, was making her quite ill. When Russell demurred, Albert dredged up a dark story from early in Victoria's reign, revealing to Russell that when Palmerston had been staying at Windsor Castle in 1837, he had entered the bedroom of a young lady-in-waiting and attempted to rape her. But rather astonishingly, Albert's bombshell completely failed to destroy Palmerston's career, as Russell said he couldn't sack him on that account. And in fact, in 1855, Palmerston became Prime Minister himself, even though the Queen had earlier declared, "I should not feel safe for a moment" if he headed government. Apart from a brief interruption of a few months, Palmerston retained the premiership throughout the next decade, and the Queen had to accept the situation. She believed this showed that I think of nothing but the country, and on the whole managed to keep on reasonably good terms with the Prime Minister. However, when Palmerston died, aged 81, in October 1865. Victoria said she did not really regret the passing of the poor old sinner, as I never liked him. While Prince Albert was alive, he effectively acted as Victoria's private secretary, carrying out so much work on her behalf that at least one observer described him as king to all intents and purposes. And I think, yes, here is a picture of him sort of showing that, you know, even when he's getting ready for bed and he's in his dressing gown, he's still sort of reading important papers. And in fact, possibly he wore himself out through overwork. Victoria certainly thought of that herself. But when he died in December 1861, the Queen was left utterly bereft and grief-stricken. From this time, Victoria always wore black. And for almost 10 years, she very rarely appeared in public, claiming it was unreasonable and unfeeling to expose a poor, broken-hearted widow to the gaze of outsiders. After Albert had been dead for 2 or 3 years, her subjects began to lose patience at her continued seclusion, and Republican sentiment began to gain ground. The Queen was most indignant if it was suggested to her that her people were entitled to see more of her, asking, really, what right has anyone to complain? And she hoped to sustain public sympathy by sitting for this 1867 painting by Sir Edwin Landseer, depicting her in deep mourning astride a pony at Osborne House, reading official correspondence. It was meant to convey that despite her unbearable sorrow, she was still assiduously attending to state business. But unfortunately, it wasn't received quite as she had intended. The pony's bridle is being held by her Highland servant, John Brown, and her close relationship had already given rise to foul-mouthed gossip. When the painting was exhibited at the Royal Academy, it provoked further ribald comments. When Albert had died, Victoria had initially shrunk from the prospect of carrying out her political responsibilities, but this had not lasted long. Whereas she was adamant that it was out of the question for her to perform what she called mere ceremonials, such as opening Parliament, she decided she must not neglect her other and higher duties. She believed that the best way of honouring Albert's memory would be to ensure that his political views were posthumously respected, declaring that since he has left all these important subjects for her to watch over, her sole future object will be to follow in everything all his wishes, great and small. Palmerston gloomily predicted that the Queen's holding all her late husband's views sacrosanct promised no end of difficulties for the politicians who would be dealing with her, but he had to accommodate himself to this. If it irritated the Queen that her subjects expected her to participate in what she disdainfully called pageants, when she had never neglected the real duties of her hard position, understandably, her ministers would have preferred it if she had reversed these priorities. One complained that she held absurdly high notions of the amount of control which she ought to exercise over public business, but they had to accept the situation. Yet Victoria did not want it to be thought that she took pleasure in her responsibilities, and instead gave out that by devoting herself to business, she risked sacrificing her health. She complained it was all so hateful to me without the interest my angel, meaning Albert, gave to it, and that overwork and constant sorrow left her feeling like a poor hunted hare. She even claimed she was almost driven mad by the stress of her hard, slave-like labour for the country, to which her ministers could well have retorted that they would have been delighted if she had opted to do less. The Queen made life difficult for them in other ways. For a time, before receiving ministers, she would send word that certain topics must be avoided, lest it should make her nervous. The fact that for years she would never spend a night at Buckingham Palace and disliked staying at Windsor Castle for long periods also created real problems for busy ministers. In order to confer with her, they regularly had to struggle to Osborne House, pictured here, on the Isle of Wight. This entailed train journeys and a boat ride, and a return trip never took less than 8 hours. Balmoral in the Scottish Highlands, also pictured in the next slide, was still more remote. And to get there, politicians were forced to waste precious hours and still more precious strength in railway journeys which would exhaust the young. Yet Victoria resisted attempts to persuade her to change her routine, insisting that her health depended on exposure to the pure Scottish air. She was indignant if during particularly fraught periods politicians begged her to return to Windsor so they could consult her more easily, to which she responded that it was outrageous that they should presume to dictate her movements. Even in 1885, by which time Albert had been dead for nearly a quarter of a century, she was annoyed when Prime Minister William Gladstone said her presence nearer London was urgently required. Although she accepted that this particular emergency did mean that she must cut short her Scottish holiday by a few days, she subsequently issued a firm diktat that ministerial crises must not happen again in Ascot weeks and Balmoral times. Victoria may have prided herself on being the guardian of Albert's political legacy, but whereas he had understood that the sovereign must not be seen as being affiliated to any political party, by the second half of her reign, Victoria was making little effort to hide where her political sympathies lay, which as time went by was in an ever more right-wing direction. The main reason for these lapses on her part was that she developed a deep hatred for the leader of the Liberal Party, William Gladstone, who became Britain's Prime Minister in 1868 and went on to serve 4 terms as head of government, still incidentally a record today. A man with a rapt, intense gaze, Gladstone was a brilliant and passionately committed politician who had started out as a right-winger himself, but who became more of a progressive as he aged. In fact, to the Queen's jaundiced and not entirely fair eye, he developed into something akin to a revolutionary. So obviously, this meant that they disagreed on many aspects of policy. But it wasn't this that really lay at the root of it, because it was a fundamental temperamental incompatibility that truly poisoned their relationship. Gladstone was an orator of genius who thrilled audiences with his speeches. Yes, here's a picture of him in the House of Commons, I think. But the interminable letters he sent his sovereign were invariably convoluted and obscurely phrased, and the Queen was driven mad by trying to interpret what he meant. Of course, once she had managed to decipher his meanings, she usually didn't like it. When they met, instead of following advice to address her in a light and airy manner, Gladstone was apt to hector her, and in view of the huge disparity in their intellects, he would inevitably get the best of the exchange. At one point, Victoria groaned, "He talks so very much," and she famously is meant to have complained that he addressed her as though she were a public meeting. When he tackled her about something, he was often much too persistent, and he sometimes also pointlessly expended political capital by engaging in needless confrontations. The upshot was that Victoria found Gladstone wonderfully unsympathetic. She complained he was very harsh and dictatorial and would listen to no reasoning or argument, as well as being possessed of an overbearing obstinacy and imperiousness that was most disagreeable. Neither Queen Victoria nor Gladstone were famed for a sense of humour, but they certainly did not share one. Victoria said he could never understand a joke. In one respect, Victoria should have recognised that she was indebted to Gladstone, because during his first premiership, which started 7 years after the death of Prince Albert, he was courageous about confronting her about her continued refusal to appear in public. Victoria was reluctant to accept this was a problem, saying criticism on this score was abominable. But by this time, her prolonged withdrawal was seriously undermining the monarchy. Groaning that the conduct of the Queen weighs upon me like a nightmare, in 1871, Gladstone sent the Lord Chancellor to Osborne to remonstrate with her, having been assured by Victoria's private secretary that despite her claims that her health was too frail to withstand the strain of public appearances, her refusal to do anything of that kind arose from pure self-indulgence. Unfortunately for Gladstone, his timing could not have been worse, because although her private secretary was correct in saying that Victoria normally had physical strength beyond any lady in her dominions, as it happened, she did fall seriously ill that summer. Victoria considered that his raising the matter at that time was proof of his lack of considerations for her, and added this to her list of grievances against him. However, once Victoria had recovered, Gladstone did prevail on her to start showing herself to her people again. For example, after she reluctantly agreed to attend a public service of Thanksgiving at St. Paul's Cathedral in February 1872, pictured on your screen here, the Queen's popularity rose markedly. Some people would actually say that in this way, Gladstone even saved the monarchy. But Victoria herself certainly saw no need to be grateful on that account. In 1874, Victoria was overjoyed when Gladstone lost the general election. He was replaced by his great Tory rival, Benjamin Disraeli, whom the Queen found infinitely more congenial. Obviously, Disraeli's political outlook was much more compatible with hers than Gladstone's had been, but he also filled her life with, as she put it, poetry, romance, and chivalry. He was an unparalleled expert when it came to buttering her up. Having famously stated that everyone likes flattery, and when you come to royalty, you should lay it on with a trowel, he certainly observed his own maxim. Always addressing her in letters as Madam and most beloved sovereign, he proclaimed she was a mistress whom to serve is to love. Another time he assured her that she was endowed with all those qualities which make life gracious and full of charm, adding that in all his varied life He had encountered nothing so interesting as this confidential correspondence with one so exalted and inspiring. There is a picture sort of painted actually after Disraeli's death of Victoria and Gladstone, and Disraeli at Osborne, and we can see Disraeli looking suitably unctuous there. As well as paying her the most graceful compliments, Disraeli praised her judgment unreservedly, noting that your Majesty's life has been passed in constant communion with great men and the knowledge and management of important transactions. He suggested that this unrivalled experience justified her taking a leading and recognised part in the government of your empire. Gladstone would later say, by encouraging Victoria's pretensions to power, Disraeli had acted as a grand corrupter, and others too felt that under his influence, Victoria became more willful. A member of Disraeli's cabinet argued that the Prime Minister was unable to control the force which he had brought into being, and undoubtedly there were times when even he found her unmanageable. The Queen herself claimed that Disraeli knew how to get around her. She recalled later, he had a habit when we differed of saying, "Dear Madam," so persuasively, but clearly this didn't always work. Although Disraeli prided himself on his management technique, explaining that in his dealings with the Queen, "I never deny, I never contradict, I sometimes forget." He acknowledged to a colleague that at some times she could be very troublesome and whimsical, like a spoilt child. Following his 1874 election defeat, Gladstone had withdrawn to the back benches. But in 1876, he enraged Victoria by coming out of retirement to attack Disraeli's foreign policy. The Turks had recently carried out dreadful massacres in Bulgaria, and Gladstone thought Britain should join with Russia to punish the Turks for these atrocities. Victoria thought that the man she now termed that mischief maker and firebrand was very, very wrong about this. In fact, when Russia invaded Turkey, Victoria believed that Britain should declare war on Russia. She ranted to Disraeli, "Oh, if the Queen were a man, she would like to go and give those Russians such a beating," repeatedly threatening to abdicate if her wishes were ignored. Some observers believed that she had completely lost control of herself, and Disraeli had considerable difficulty convincing her that going to war would not be advisable. All this meant that Victoria hated Gladstone more than ever. When Disraeli lost the 1880 election, the Queen was extremely reluctant to take back Gladstone as her Prime Minister on the grounds that he no longer enjoyed her confidence. Although she ultimately had to agree to his return, their relations over the next 5 years were appalling. Alleging that the Queen had evolved into an imperious despot, Gladstone claimed her mind was now too warped to give judgment on public affairs, and he once moaned to his wife, "She will never be happy till she has hounded me out of office." When Gladstone's second term of office ended in 1885, the Queen fervently hoped he would retire, but she had not seen the back of him. The following year, Gladstone resumed the premierships in hopes of introducing Home Rule for Ireland. Since this was a policy to which Victoria was viscerally opposed, she believed that she was entitled to do all she could to block it. She now broke the most basic of constitutional rules by forwarding to Lord Salisbury, who had become Conservative leader after Disraeli's death and was now leading the opposition, much of Gladstone's confidential correspondence to her. And she also secretly met with Salisbury to coordinate opposition to Home Rule. To her delight, In July 1886, the Home Rule Bill was defeated, and Salisbury became Prime Minister in his turn. But Gladstone had not yet abandoned politics, and following the general election of 1892, he became Prime Minister for the fourth time at the age of 82. And this print shows a rather idealised depiction of Gladstone kissing the Queen's hand in a decidedly courtly fashion, while she looks on benignly. But in fact, the encounter was a good deal more frosty than this suggests. Gladstone reported that he had found her in nothing helpful, and she had acted as if she was Mary Antoinette meeting her executioner. As for Victoria, prior to this meeting, she had raged that the prospect of having that dangerous old fanatic thrust down her throat was quite ludicrous. It is a bad joke. Showing an almost comical incomprehension of the democratic process, she told her daughter, "It seems to me a defect in our much-famed constitution to have to part with an admirable government like Lord Salisbury's for no reason, merely on account of the number of votes." Much to her relief, Gladstone once again failed to secure Home Rule for Ireland, and in 1894 he stood down as Liberal leader. Victoria did not disguise her satisfaction at his departure, and after he tendered his resignation, she wrote what Gladstone described as a curt letter containing not a word of regret or gratitude. Her treatment of him so preyed on his mind that nearly 2 years after he left office, Gladstone was still being tormented by dreams in which she featured. In 1886, a cartoonist had actually depicted Gladstone having a nightmare about Queen Victoria, and in some ways this actually prefigured his experience while in retirement. In his diary, he recorded that he had dreamt that Victoria had invited him to breakfast alone with her at Windsor, but when the hour came, he could not find where they were to meet, and had found himself running frantically about the castle trying to locate her. On waking, he had realised that despite striving to attain as nearly as I could indifference about her, his feelings towards Victoria clearly had more hold upon me than I was aware. For Gladstone, what he termed his painful relations with the Queen may have been the stuff of nightmares. But on the whole, her 9 other prime ministers viewed her in a much more positive light. Although she had had several political disagreements with Gladstone's successor as leader of the Liberals, Lord Rosebery, who was Prime Minister for 15 months after Gladstone stepped down in March 1894, when Rosebery lost power in 1895, he told the Queen his only regret in laying down his office was that it meant the cessation of personal relations with your Majesty. Of course, Victoria's prime ministers often found her trying. But while she could be undeniably difficult and demanding, years of experience in dealing with state affairs and her long acquaintance with generations of distinguished men and foreign rulers gave an undeniable weight to her judgment. Notwithstanding their mutual detestation, there were times when even Gladstone acknowledged that her interventions could be positive. In 1884, after the Queen helped resolve an intractable parliamentary impasse, he sent her a telegram saying simply, "Humbly congratulate." Others had genuine respect for what she could offer. At her death, Lord Salisbury commented on the profound penetration, almost intuition, which she brought to bear on political questions. One long-serving Foreign Secretary, Lord Clarendon, gave a fair assessment when he remarked, "The Queen's opinion is always worth hearing, even if you do not agree with it." Right to the end of her long life, she maintained her supervision of political affairs, dedicating herself to ensuring that Britain did not degenerate into what she termed a second-rate power. Despite her claim that she had always disliked politics and that she participated in such matters reluctantly and even with disgust, she held her own with the forceful and impressive men who rose to the top of the greasy pole during her reign.
Gosh, Anne, thank you so much. That was interesting and enlightening. And I have to say, for those of you listening, I bought the book probably 3 or 4 months ago, and it's 640 pages, so quite a tome. And I thought, gosh, this will be hard to get through. It was wonderful. Granted, I'm very biased because I love British history, but it just flew by. Your writing style is fantastic, so thank you so much.
Cool,
Before we
cool.
before we get to your questions, we have some upcoming programs that I would like to mention. On July 28th at the Boston Public Library, I will be moderating a discussion with Henry Winsick about his new book, Stan and Gus, Art, Ardor, and the Friendship That Built the Gilded Age. This free presentation will also be broadcast live for those of you who can't be with us in Boston. On August 8th, I will be presenting an online lecture on Great British jewelry collections and country houses. And then finally, on August 22nd, I will be hosting Erica Loam for an online presentation entitled Stitching a Lineage, Embroidered Coats of Arms in 18th Century Boston. You can find more information about all these events at americanancestors.org/events. Now, let's get to your questions. Go ahead and type your query into the question panel on the bottom, and we will answer as many as we can in the time provided. And I'm going to start off with the first question. And do you think that Queen Victoria was a hypochondriac? I think we've lost Anne. Anne, are you there? Can you elaborate a bit on the various characters in the Christmas cartoon? Am I correct that there was an American Indian and
Um,
African American woman?
n-
Oh, there
no,
you are back,
no, I
Anne.
can't. I can't hear Kurt.
Can you hear me, Anne?
I can't hear Kurt at the moment.
Right. Um, Kelly, can you hear me? Can you take over the
Um,
questions?
oh
Hi,
God.
Kurt. Yes, I
Um,
can hear you. I'm going to type in your question to Anne.
I hope now I can. I sorry, my microphone had switched itself off.
So you can hear
Hello?
me now, Anne?
Yes, sorry, it switches itself off rather annoyingly. Anyway,
No,
sorry.
no,
Hello. Yes.
no problem. Hello. Did you hear it? So this question is, can you elaborate a bit on the various characters in the Christmas cartoon? Am I correct that there was an American Indian and an African American woman?
Well, I must admit I am sort of slightly mystified myself about it. Is there a China? Actually, without the picture in front of me, um,
Well,
I
Kelly, can
I'm
you go
not
back
sure
to
I
that
can.
picture? We'll
I'm not
swing
sure I
back to
will
it.
elucidate it very much. Um, I, 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 I think so. I think it's 1886. So Gladstone's out of office, and I don't know. There seems to be quite a lot of sort of foreign people, and I don't know if that's sort of suggesting that Gladstone's upset about the Queen's foreign policy, or maybe it's possibly a reference to the Queen liking the Empire so much, and Gladstone wasn't a great fan of the Empire. So I think some of those people pictured there, are sort of from Britain's overseas possessions. I can't really give a sort of precise analysis of it, but it's just the sort of general idea that Victoria is haunting Gladstone's nightmares.
So I'll jump in here, Carol, who's the one who asked the question, and say I suspect that what may look like an American Indian is probably a Canadian. Native American, because that was very much a part of the empire. And there are obviously many dark-skinned people from out the empire. So I think it's probably just meant to symbolize all these people coming in from all over the world in in this nightmare. Linda says that she saw the play The Audience, where the Prime Minister met with the Queen every week. Was that happening during Victoria's reign?
They didn't have formal weekly audiences, but she sort of met slightly more ad hoc. I mean, you know, when there was a particular important piece of business or some piece of legislation, um, the Prime Minister would come to talk it over with her, but there weren't sort of set weekly times set aside for them to meet, sort of thing. Um, so so it was a bit different, but and in fact, you know, she could go quite, but as time went by, Gladstone became rather sort of reluctant to meet with her, actually, because he had he started to have a suspicion that she was, you know, violating his confidence by um, communicating with the leader of the opposition, and so I think he sort of slightly tried to avoid seeing her um, on an absolutely regular basis.
Well, and who can blame him? Lorraine asked if the Queen helped in the Irish famine personally by contributing money.
She did. I mean, you know, I'm afraid no one English really comes out very well from the Irish famine, and um, Queen Victoria. I mean, she there is a slightly unattractive remark in her journal when she sort of more or less says, sort of, I can't help feeling that the Irish are rather feckless. I mean, almost implying that they're rather to blame. But she did contribute quite a sizable sum. I think it's between her and Albert, they contribute £2,500. And you know, I think sometimes a myth got around that the Queen contributed £5, but that wasn't true. I mean, and I mean, she was more sympathetic and compassionate than quite a lot of people in Britain were. But at the same time, she was pretty fatalistic, and you know, she felt, oh, nothing can be done, and so, for instance, she didn't question the idea that food couldn't be sent to Ireland, and I mean,
Oh,
you know,
interesting.
she went along with that, but in general, I mean, I'm afraid on the whole, I mean, certainly later in the reign, it's she's is shown in not the most appealing light in her attitude to Ireland. I mean, she's always saying things like the Irish are a dreadful people and things, but specifically as regards the famine, she, you know, she wasn't too callous, but you know, it's not an episode that anyone can look back on, you know, very happily. Any English person can consider we behaved well.
Indeed. I will say for our audience that £2,500 was a lot of money then. So kudos to her for making that contribution. And speaking of Prince Albert, how much power do you think he actually really wielded?
Um, I think he did. Um, he was extremely influential, and I mean, he worked tirelessly and read all the foreign dispatches and wrote policy documents himself. And the fiction had to be preserved that um, you know, he wasn't really doing all this because in theory the constitutional position was that it was the Queen who had to deal with the ministers, but in fact, you know, he would write a letter and then the Queen would um, copy it out herself, sort of thing.
Um,
But at the same time, I mean, when when he died, and she sort of said, "Oh Lord, what shall I do? You know, he did everything. I didn't everything, and I've no idea how I'll, tackle business." But in fact, she, even just copying out the letters he wrote, it wasn't a sort of mindless exercise. So she had sort of absorbed his thinking, and in fact, she involves herself in political questions pretty quickly after his death. So um, I think there was sometimes in Albert's lifetime some of the politicians, privately felt that the Queen literally did nothing and that Albert um, was the only one who was active in but I don't think that was true, actually. I think that it was a partnership, although Albert was, the more active partner when it came to politics.
Speaking of love, do you think the Queen actually did have an affair with John Brown?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I don't think she did have an affair, but um, perhaps that's very naive of me. But I just find it sort of unthinkable that, she could have um, indulged in the necessary deception and dishonesty and indeed risk entailed in such a thing. Um, and I mean, there's also, uh, I think it's sometimes said that after her last child was born in 1857, that her doctors had advised she shouldn't have another child, and certainly she did have medical problems that you can understand why she was given that advice. So that would be another thing. The only thing that has made me, sort of, well, that's a very odd thing, is that um, towards after John Brown's death, and the vicar, the minister at the church near Balmoral, on his deathbed, said to his sister that he felt guilty about having secretly married Victoria and John Brown. But um, assuming that that's, it is true that that happened, um, I think, it could have been that the vicar could have been, delirious, not making much sense on his deathbed, and might have said this sort of strange thing. But that did make me think, well, that is a little odd, certainly. But on the whole, I genuinely don't believe that it was a physical affair.
And the last question, who do you think was Victoria's favorite PM?
Oh, I think Disraeli wins that competition. I mean, to begin with, it looked like no one would ever come close to Melbourne. But actually, after his death, she's slightly disloyal about Melbourne and sort of says, actually, I don't think he was a very good prime minister. Whereas Disraeli, she went on loving and mourned him tremendously, and wished he was still. I mean, it actually, after he's out of office, she goes on consulting him and writing to him when she shouldn't have. But after he dies, she keeps saying that she wished she could consult him again, and that he was so lovable, and so I think no one came close to touching Disraeli.
Right. Well, thank you again, Anne, so much for today. That is all the time we have for questions. If you have any other questions, you can contact us at heritagetours@americanancestors.org. Thank you again for joining us today. As you leave the event, you'll have the opportunity to fill out a survey and give us your feedback. As we continue to expand our webinars and online offerings, any and all feedback is extremely helpful and appreciated. This free webinar was made possible by the generous support of members and friends around the world. please consider making a gift to American Ancestors to keep these programs free and to create more programs for you and others to enjoy. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I hope to see you soon again on our future online programs. Goodbye for now.